So a lot of people talk about books that have changed their lives. And for me, it was this book, The Elfin World of Mosses and Liverworts of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Isle Royale. When I first got this book in my hands when I was an undergraduate botany student, my world literally changed, because not only was I now looking out at across the world, I was getting down on my hands and knees and looking at this fantastic world that bryophytes make up. And before we go in and start talking about what bryophytes are exactly, it's important to take a step back and think about how we use terms like primitive and early and advanced and derived. Bryophytes are often considered these primitive plants because they lack a lot of the features that kind of vascular plants have, such as like vascular plant or vascular tissue or seeds and flowers and things like that. But these plants aren't necessarily primitive, or neither are vascular plants advanced. We use the terms basal and derived to consider when we consider these plants. And the reason might not be very apparent why bryophytes aren't necessarily primitive. And so I like to use the metaphor of my 2007 Ford Freestyle car. Now, this car is getting a little old in the tooth. It has a lot of miles on it, but it has a lot of key features in it that make it a very kind of efficient car. The CD player used to work, and it used to be great. It had a good radio in it, still does, but it also has all these different things like fluids that make sure to regulate the engine, allows me to get better gas mileage and drive farther, and also a battery to allow me to start the car pretty easily. Now, you would say that this car is much more advanced than a Ford Model A or something like that, because the Model A and the Freestyle, they're very similar to each other. They have the same rather basic functions. You put in gas, it moves pistons and drives the car. But my Ford Freestyle does this a lot more efficiently and allows me to do a lot more things. But despite this, if I wanted to drive from my house to the store, both these cars, as long as they're in good shape, would get me there. They would still be able to complete this task. But one would just do it with a lot more features and allow me to have a little bit more comfort to it and do other things besides just going right to the store. And this is a similar way to how we should think about biological organisms, that no matter, even if these features aren't as kind of fancy and built up, they're still being able to do the basic function. And for biology, that is to be able to reproduce and put more genes into the next generation. So when we talk about plants, especially these plants that are more basal, we often think about this group called the bryophytes. And the bryophytes are a large, interesting clade of non-vascular plants. They don't have any lignin or wood in them, and so generally they're very small. But it's important to point out that even though they are basal, they do have a lot of quite interesting adaptations. Especially some of them have specializations to deal with water inside of them. They also have, unlike a lot of the other plants that we're going to talk about for the rest of the class, their main stage of functionality is the gametophyte stage. In fact, some of them have a sporophyte. They all have sporophytes, but those sporophytes are often simple and very unbranched. And these bryophytes can be divided into three large groups: the liverworts, the true mosses, and a small, kind of interesting group called the hornworts. Bryophytes shouldn't be thought of just as small little plants, because they are interesting and are really diverse around the globe. They lack many traits that other plants have, but they have a lot of interesting adaptations on their own, and that has allowed them to be spread across the globe and even in some cases dominate environments. To go up to where I'm from in northern Michigan and even further north into Canada, most of the landscape is almost completely dominated by bryophytes, especially sphagnum mosses, which make up vast amounts of peatlands throughout the globe. And being able to dominate, though, has some limitations for these bryophytes, because Bryophytes are going to lack vascular tissue, so that xylem and phloem that we've talked about can't be found in that. And so bryophyte life is very much constricted by this key adaptation that has allowed plants to be so successful at land. But despite this, bryophytes are on land and they're in a variety of diverse habitats, everywhere from moist habitats to even some of our really dry habitats in deserts and in dune systems. And they do this through being kind of just trying to conform to the environment they're in and use any available water that might be there efficiently. And we call this poikilohydry, where they're able to adapt to the water that's standing there. Another key feature bryophytes have that they can live without this vascular tissue is that they're able to use the geometry of their bodies to kind of better efficiently manage water. And what this allows them to do is, a lot of times we think of bryophytes as being tiny, and that's no secret why they are. Because if you're smaller or have smaller shapes, you have a higher surface area to volume area ratio. And what this allows you to do is more easily get water into your body and transport it around. Because the larger you are, the more internal space you have, and the further that water needs to transport to get to individual cells. But by being small, you're able to move things around without the need for a lot of energy or resources, and you don't need vascular tissue. So as long as you're staying small as a bryophyte, you're going to be able to more easily transport things around. And it's going to be able to make you live in these habitats without having tons of water around. Especially you can see this illustrated by looking at a liverwort tissue versus a dicot tissue. The dicot tissue of a flowering plant is very specialized, whereas a liverwort tissue isn't, because the liverwort just needs to get things through it very easily. Another key adaptation we see bryophytes doing is being very picky of where they live. And they tend to be in places with lots of water, or at least periods where water is very abundant to them. And by being small, you're able to better choose where you're at, because you're able to exploit what we call microclimates. So these areas that are kind of sheltered in a way that provide abundance in a particular resource. And we see this in a lot of where bryophytes live. Where I'm from, this species is kind of a rare species. This is Schistostega pinnata, known as the Luminescent Moss. And they like to live in kind of dark, damp caves where there's not a lot of light. And the water is there and it's abundant and damp and they can use it, but getting that light has been their problem. And so what they're able to do is, even a little bit amount of light, they're able to grab it and reflect it internally in there. And so when you look into a cave with this moss, it appears like kind of this dim glow is staring back at you. And it's really a magical experience to come across these, especially when you were a young botanist and didn't know what this plant was at first. These bryophytes are also, a lot of them are really good at storing water. Particularly sphagnum moss is good at, when it gets water, to keep it in and not let it go. And if we look at sphagnum moss and take a cross-section of it, you can see it has these very large specialized cells. And that allows them to hold in a lot of moisture. In fact, that kind of ability to kind of take in moisture has been used by humans in order to use them as bandages or other kind of important means that we need to absorb things. Bryophytes are often also good at shutting down their metabolism if they need to. This moss right here, known as Hedwigia, is when it's dry and doesn't have any water in it, it shrivels up and it closes. And these white tips around it are able to reflect more light, so light coming in is not ruining any of the photosynthetic mechanisms while it doesn't have water to split for photosynthesis. But if you just put a little water on it, or if it rains, these open right up almost before your eyes to start photosynthesizing with that abundant water around them. Bryophytes have a very distinct alternation of generation life cycle. And we see the gametophyte is going to be the most dominant part of this life cycle. It's the part that's going to do most of the photosynthesizing, and also it's going to hold the reproductive structures on it. The reproductive phase of this life is known as the sporophyte. And many times the sporophyte on there that's going to release spores to reproduce is actually physically a separate plant on there. In fact, some people think that the sporophyte is more of a parasite on the gametophyte. And this trend is going to get changed quite a bit as we start to look over the plant kingdom. But for right now, the gametophyte is going to be our primary stage of action in these plants. But despite this kind of interesting life cycle where the gametophytes is common, bryophytes have very complex ways to sexually reproduce. Liverworts, for instance, have both the sexual phases, but they also have asexual phases where they're able to kind of lob off pieces of them to start new plants. And that's allowed liverworts in particular to be a fairly successful and often weedy species. Some bryophytes also have interactions with other organisms, especially the animal kingdom. One of the most famous examples of this in bryophytes is this moss species known as dung moss. This species specializes on growing on poop. In particular, there's one species in Canada that specializes on moose poop in bogs only. And their gametophytes are really good at growing on poop, but their sporophytes also have specialized adaptations. In particular, they're able to distribute their spores by growing very attractive, brightly colored sporophytes that attract flies to them. And these flies are able to end up landing on the sporophytes, taking up spores, and then distributing them to other piles of poop. And this allows them to very kind of key in and specialize and get very efficiently distributed to preferable habitats in their environment. So when we think about bryophytes, there's three main groups that we're going to be talking about. And these clades are what we believe are fairly sister to actual true vascular plants. And each of these clades has kind of special adaptations to it. The liverworts up here are thought to be one of the more basal, but they seem to have the less adaptations to it. The bryophyta, the mosses, are going to have stoma on them, some of the species do, as well as a kind of pseudoxylem to them. And so we think of them as more derived organisms. And then lastly, we have this weird group called the hornworts, which also possess what we believe are functional stomata. So in the lab this week, you're going to be asked to kind of key out and look at different groups of bryophytes that you find in the wild. And bryophyte diversity is really actually pretty diverse out there. And there's a lot of different habitats. So I want to briefly just go through some of these groups to kind of give you a heads up. And remember, there is a key in Canvas that you can use to help you figure out what you're looking at in the field. The first big group of bryophytes is the Marchantiophyta, or the liverworts. And these are given that term because they have a liver-like appearance to them. In fact, some of these species were thought to help in liver functions, which turns out that's a really bad idea in several of them that we used to use. It's a huge group of known about 9,000 species out there. Especially in tropical environments, they seem to be very common. The liverworts come in two big varieties. The thallus form, which has these kind of liver-like, kind of snake almost appearance to them, and then leafy forms, which look a lot like other bryophytes, and they kind of have these kind of long pseudo-leaves on them. Many of them have rhizoids too, but usually these rhizoids are single-celled. And none of these are going to have what's known as a costa, or a nerve that goes through any of their leaf tissues. Of this group, the Marchantia, which is a very common weedy organism, has been used as a model plant quite a bit. In fact, in evolutionary studies, when we look at how these big groups are related to each other, this is usually the go-to plant to get DNA from. Many of these liverworts also have very unique chemistry. In particular, Connocephala, this leafy or this thallus liverwort right here, has a very distinct smell to it. It kind of smells like a cinnamony, fishy kind of smell to it. And this chemistry has been linked to herbivory. There's a whole group of moths that specialize on eating these, and it's a way for that plant to defend itself. The biggest group of bryophytes is the Bryophyta, or the true mosses. And a lot of times these plants are thought of as being small trees because they really do have structures that make them look like miniature trees. And this is where we see the most abundant diversity of Bryophyta, with over 12,000 species. And they come in a lot of shapes and sizes and do different things, but generally when you think about bryophytes, you want to think about them in three big groups. First, we have this Acrocarpus Mosses, and these are mosses that kind of stand straight up, much like A stands straight up in Acrocarpus. Next, we have the Pleocarpus Mosses, which is our blankets. They kind of trail and cover things. You can think of this as the P. That P is a little stretched out there, and so the Pleocarpus Mosses. And then we have the Sphagnum Mosses, which are a really important economic species throughout the globe. Now, bryophytes, we say, don't have vascular tissue, but some of these bryophytes actually have structures that you could consider are vascular tissue, because they are specialized to transport water, but it's very non-analogous to the vascular tissue that we see in other plants. And that big group of Sphagnum moss, it's important to reiterate how important it's been, especially for northern cultures. Sphagnum moss is fairly resistant to decay, and so in areas where sphagnum has grown, they often have large deposits that don't decay that well in the ground. And because of this, people have taken advantage of it for years. We've used it to build houses, to make to fuel sources, as well as in medical bandages. In fact, World War I, if you got shot, you were likely to get a tourniquet made out of sphagnum moss. And even to this day, we use sphagnum in a lot of horticulture applications because it's able to retain a lot of water. Though we are realizing now that there's some sustainability issues with it, and we've decided to rethink of what we're using in our horticulture industry. The last little group of mosses, or bryophytes, is this group called the Anthroceratophyta, or the hornworts. And this is a really kind of mysterious group that we still need to do a lot of studies on to really understand its place in the plant kingdom. There's only about 100 to 150 species, and many more of them are yet to be named because this is a very tropical group that we still don't know a lot of. In fact, a lot of them we've never seen sporophytes on, and so we can't necessarily place them yet. Most of the time when you see them, they're going to be small, weedy species around here. In fact, there's only about one species that you would find natively to Utah. Their sporophyte consisted of this little kind of odd form to them, where they get the name hornworts. And it's thought that they might be an important model species for exploring early plant diversity. So in summary, bryophytes are a large group of non-vascular plants. And not having vascular tissue makes them kind of unique, but also imposes important challenges on them that they've been able to rise up and kind of conform to their environment. And these have allowed them to be almost completely throughout every ecosystem and even dominate certain ecosystems in our globe. And there's three main groups of them: the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. And I would suggest that this week, as you're learning about bryophytes, to take some time, get down on your hands and knees, and really put your face in a pile of moss, because they really are kind of a unique little elfin world out there.